Hey, Brian.
So happy to be with you, Micky.
Oh, thanks. So glad you could sit down and chat with me for a few minutes at Wild Goose. It's always crazy here.
It is crazy, although this is what it's about. You bump into somebody, you sit down and talk, and so here we are.
It's good. It's good. So, one of the things that happens as you meet people at Wild Goose and you have a moment to talk is you start to hear parts of their story. Yeah. And I feel like so many times the really juicy sessions and conversations are when people get to tell their stories, when people are listening to other people's stories, and there's that exchange. And I think one of the beautiful things that's bubbling up right now in our culture in many ways is kind of the multiplicity of narratives, and we're starting to be open to more narratives.
Yeah.
Understanding that there isn't a single story.
Yes.
And that there are many threads of story being woven through. So how have you seen that kind of bubble up at Wild Goose for you? Have you seen those narratives, those multiple narratives bubble up?
Yeah, so I spent yesterday doing all-day free conference thing, just as you did, and mine was called Church Camp, and we were talking about church. And that idea of story narrative came up in so many different ways, one of which being that all of us are part of denominations or traditions or congregations, each that are at inflection points in their stories, Some have been living in a story of decline, a story of aging, others in a story of renewal, rebirth, others in a story of we know what we used to do didn't work and now we're looking for what to do next. And so I think that is interesting. I think one of the things that a lot of us are trying to do is break out of the idea that there's this static thing called normalcy and realize, no, that in itself is a way of masking people's stories. No, that everything is in flux. I mean, that's what evolution's all about. Everything is in flux and everything's coming from somewhere, going somewhere. And I think when we start doing that, it helps people become, as Paulo Freire said, protagonists in their own narrative, protagonists in their own story, rather than being victims or have their story happen to them because other people are the actors. We get to be activated. So, and one of the things I love about Wild Goose is you're just walking along, hey, and people have a habit of actually saying hello. And, this morning I went down for my hard-boiled egg at the bed and breakfast where I'm staying and ended up in this really interesting conversation with an environmental activist and heard how she got into that work. It just happens left and right.
Yeah. Oh, that's so great. And I met somebody yesterday who a friend told her about Wild Goose. She didn't know anything about it and decided to just come on a whim and said, I'm not a Christian, I'm not a religious person, but rarely have I been in a space where I feel like I can just ask any question and it's going to be fine. Like I can just talk about these things that we don't often get to talk about.
Yes.
For a country that says it's, a Christian country or spiritually based and there's so much religion everywhere.
Yeah.
There are a few places where we can actually ask questions.
Yes.
Especially any kind of question that might be off the catechism script.
Yes, so true. And that comes back to what you were saying about the existence of multiple narratives, where a whole lot of us, we are raised in certain stories, racial stories, religious stories, political stories, whatever. And your assumption is the people who are acceptable are people who are part of my story.
Yeah.
And it's almost like getting over a shock. A whole lot of people, the first time they meet someone who's part of a different story, they don't know how to react. Am I allowed to like you? Am I allowed to be interested? Or am I supposed to immediately, And there is something about becoming comfortable. Like, I don't expect you to be part of the same story I am. You don't expect that of me. That's a liberating thing, and it creates a different kind of space, like for that person.
Yeah.
When I got in, we had a lot of rain the other night when I came in, and there was a mudslide that shut down the road.
Wow.
So my wife and I sat in our rental car for an hour while bulldozers came to clear away the mud. So it was some drama. So it's about 1 o'clock in the morning. We're getting settled in our bed and breakfast, and someone else arrived, and she had driven from couple thousand miles away in Canada, and doesn't know anybody here.
Wow.
Because she had this sense like, I just want to, it sounds like a space where I want to be.
Yeah. Wow, I love that. So, the other thing I know that you've been playing with as far as narratives is kind of those overarching stories that we tell in our culture. So I would love to hear about that work.
Yeah.
And I know you've been working with our friend Gareth Higgins on that. And so how we start to tell, I guess, different meta-narratives, or at least examine the ones we have, which I do think, still relates to what we're doing at Wild Goose, because, that's one of the things. Now having this being my 7th goose, like, I feel very reflective this year, and I can remember that first year and some of the meta-narratives for me that were like, oh, we don't have to do this way? Like, oh, I'm allowed to think that or explore that or question that,
even listen to that,
right?
Yeah.
So I think that's what you're doing too with Corey and the 7th story, and your work around the 7th story is this, like, oh, I can question that narrative. I didn't even realize it was a narrative, and now I'm questioning it.
That's the big piece, I think. We inherit certain narratives, and we're told it's normal. We're told it's the way things are. They're disguised often with terms like worldview. But what they really are is stories, and there are people with vested interests who tell every story. And what helps is to at least become aware, oh, here are the interests involved in the generation of this story, and so on. So, where all this arose for me, I was a pastor for 24 years, and I was grappling with the Gospels, and I started to realize that the Pharisees and religious leaders in Jesus' day, they had a certain story they were working by. Herod and Caesar and the Herodian party, they had a certain story they were working by. The Zealots had a certain story. And so when I started grappling with that, I realized, gosh, those stories come up everywhere. And so what I ended up grappling with this over a period of time. My background, I was an English teacher, so I'm interested in plots and narrative and all the rest. But I realized that when I identified 6 common stories, virtually every headline I read in the paper made sense within one of those stories. One is a story of domination. We're going to get peace and security, or we're going to get profit and power or whatever by being in control, right? Yeah. And then you have, I call that the domination story, then you have the revolution story. Well, 2 of those stories have a whole lot to do with what makes the world go round. And then I started to realize that all of those 6 common stories have a way of leading to conflict and violence and oppression and injustice. And how around the world in different traditions, I think this is what Jesus was about. Frankly, I think it's what the Buddha was about. So many great leaders through history, they're looking for a different story that will send us into the world for encounters for the common good rather than encounters for exploitation.
Yeah, that's good. So I want to pivot back to the goose, just because Adam and I talked earlier. Adam's on the board too, and we're talking a little bit about the people that come here and what the goose is like and what's happened over the years of the goose. And I know that one, you are, I think at this point, kind of seen as maybe one of the fathers of the emergent movement or progressive Christianity. A lot of us,
a lot of people are saying grandfather.
Okay, I put too much up there. And so, I'm just saying, I think a lot of people are seeing you move into at least that elder role, kind of encouraging newer voices or younger voices and that kind of thing. But what are the turns, or where are the things that we need to be paying attention to here at Wild Goose? I think we've done a really great job with LGBTQ inclusion. Like, I've even seen how that has changed and grown over the years from the first year I was here. To, there are places where we still struggle, maybe around race. And so what is that you think we're still kind of struggling with or need to, get it together around in order to make this everything that we really do believe the goose can be.
Yeah, any generalization is risky, right? So I'm about to make a risky one. So, the fact that LGBTQ was so front and center in the early years of the Goose created one kind of racial connection. And that was that one thing that folks from black religious communities and white religious communities had in common was that many of them were unfriendly toward queer people. So there was a certain sense that folks who were sensitive toward LGBT inclusion in black and white and Latino and Asian churches, we all had that in common. That became a natural place to come together. But of course, then we have all kinds of new conversations that have to happen about what's going on in our country with this resurgence of white nationalism, white supremacy, this ugly, ugly nativism, oddly, that sometimes recruits black and brown people to join with white people in resenting whoever is at the door next, right? Which is part of the long American history of whiteness. So, and this is such a big challenge, and one of our big challenges is you can have a group of people who go through the rethinking process in this. Let's say especially a group of white people who go through this. Obviously nobody ever arrives, but there are certain barriers you get over, certain breakthroughs you have, certain relationships that develop, and then those relationships continue and enrich people. But then you have the next wave of people who've never been part of that. And if these people judge those people, you know what I'm saying? It's, then you can end up in a sort of a competition of who's more, I'm more woke than that.
For sure.
These people. So all of that, I think, is something we will continue to struggle with if we do our job. In other words, that's a problem we will only have if we keep welcoming new people into the conversation. That's one. Another one, I think, is age. And the spiritual roots of Wild Goose meant are part of our magic. It's part of what's beautiful here is that spirituality is a topic that we can talk about. But the younger you go, the less a smaller percentage of people have productive roots in a faith community. And so how are we going to engage with spirituality 20 years from now, for example, when fewer and fewer people either are trying to deconstruct a religious heritage that didn't work for them, but it's just going to be a new landscape. I think that will be a continuing challenge for us.
Well, good. Yeah, I think as someone who has also seen kind of the ebbs and flows, I think if we keep asking questions and keep challenging ourselves, especially all of us who consider this our thing.
Yes.
There are going to be people who come and go, who come to the Goose once, who come to speak or whatever. But there are those of us who really think this is our thing.
Yeah.
And so how do we keep, plugging in there? And it doesn't mean you have to do the same thing every year. As I've done different things here. And so I think it's really about how do we just continue to consider this our community.
I think this is one of the realities that we'll have to get comfortable with. Some people coming here one year was what they needed, right? Some people came looking for something that they didn't get, and so they go somewhere else. That's okay, you know. But I think we have to, will continue to struggle with a challenge in a nation whose history, racially, is about exploitation and apartheid. Even though we don't call it that.
Sure.
A nation with that kind of a history, it's like, I hate to use such a graphic metaphor, but it is like a deep wound. And one little cell has to come and connect with one little cell, and sometimes under strain the beginnings of healing tear, and then you have to start again. I wish there were a fast way to magically fix it, but on the other hand, that's how bodies heal. It's how living things heal, and I think that's and there's tenderness in that, there's courage in that. And I think that's what we're all trying to do. And I think you and I both, this is something we carry in our soul and in our body. It's something we love. It's part of why we love each other.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, thank you for chatting with me. It has been wonderful. We'll have to catch up more, of course.
I feel that way. You gotta take a walk.
Yes.